Be me, Bernice. 25 years old, living in some generic mid-sized city. Got a degree that was supposed to help people. Now I work for a nonprofit that mostly helps itself to grant money. My life revolves around a few core principles: social justice, intersectional feminism, and dismantling the patriarchy. One smug online comment at a time. My best friend is Emma. She's like me, but more so. If I'm at 100, she's at 100, always ready to point out some new subtle form of oppression I missed. We're a team. We go to rallies, we share articles, we spend hours in coffee shops dissecting the problematic nature of everything from air conditioning to lawn care. For a while, I had a boyfriend. His name was Jack. Jack was fine. That was the problem. He was just fine. He worked a normal job, had normal hobbies, and possessed a level of blissful ignorance that used to be charming, but was now starting to feel like a personal attack. I'd come home fuming about some injustice I'd witnessed or read about, ready to deconstruct the systemic issues at play. I'd explain how a movie we watched was steeped in toxic masculinity. Jack would just nod, say, "Huh, I never thought of that," and then ask what was for dinner. It was like trying to explain color to a rock. He wasn't a bad person. He was kind, he was patient, he'd fix the leaky faucet without me having to ask. But he wasn't an ally. He was a bystander. And in my world, bystanders were part of the problem. The frustration had been building for months, a slow, simmering pot of resentment. The final straw came after a particularly long day at work. My boss had praised a male colleague for an idea that was basically a watered-down version of something I'd proposed weeks earlier. I was furious. I got home, ready for a fight, ready for Jack to share in my outrage. I found him on the couch, watching some dumb action movie. I launched into the story, hitting all the key points: male privilege, systemic bias, the way women's voices are silenced in the workplace. I finished my tirade, breathing heavily, waiting for him to validate my anger. He looked at me, a little confused, and said, "That sucks. Did you talk to your boss about it?" I just stared at him. Talk to my boss? As if a simple conversation could undo centuries of patriarchal conditioning. I told him he just didn't get it, and he never would. He sighed. It was a tired sigh. The sigh of a man who knew he was walking through a minefield and had just stepped on another one. He said he was just trying to help. I told him his version of help was part of the problem. The conversation went nowhere, as it always did. I went to bed angry. He slept on the couch. The next day I met Emma for coffee. I told her everything. She listened intently, nodding in all the right places. When I was done, she took a long sip of her oat milk latte and looked at me with profound seriousness. She said I was doing all the emotional labor in the relationship, that it wasn't my job to educate him, that he was draining my energy I needed for the real fight. She told me I deserved a partner who was already on my level, not a project I had to build from scratch. Every word she said felt like a revelation. It was exactly what I was feeling, but articulated with a clarity I couldn't muster myself. It was permission. I went home that evening with a strange sense of purpose. Jack was in the kitchen making dinner. He smiled when I walked in, like he was hoping we could just move past last night. I didn't smile back. I told him we needed to talk. We sat at the kitchen table. He looked nervous. I laid it all out. I used the words Emma had given me. Emotional labor. Unequal partnership. You're not doing the work. I told him that his very existence as a non-confrontational average man upheld the systems that oppressed me. His silence, his go-with-the-flow attitude, was a form of complicity. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there, listening. His face was blank. Not angry, not sad, just empty. When I was finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the fridge humming. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "So, what are you saying?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I'm saying this isn't working," I said. "I can't do this anymore." He just nodded slowly. "Okay." That was it. No begging, no pleading, no dramatic declarations of love. Just, okay. Part of me was insulted by his lack of a fight. The other part was relieved. He got up, went into the bedroom, and started packing a bag. He moved with a quiet efficiency. He took his clothes, his toothbrush, the video game console. He didn't take any of the things we'd bought together. Within an hour, he was standing at the door with 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. He looked at me one last time. "Take care of yourself, Bernice," he said. And then he was gone. The moment the door closed, I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I was free. I texted Emma, "It's done. I'm finally free." Her reply was instant. "So proud of you. This is the first day of your new life." The first few weeks were great. The apartment was mine. I could decorate it how I wanted. No more ugly sports memorabilia. No more leaving the toilet seat up. I had so much more time for activism, for reading, for myself. I felt powerful, independent. I was a woman who had refused to settle. I expected to hear from Jack. A sad text, maybe a late-night call, nothing. It was like he had vanished from the face of the earth. I told myself it was for the best. He was processing his toxic behavior, probably, giving me space. I decided to get back into dating. This time, I'd be smarter. I put intersectional feminist right in my profile. I swiped left on anyone holding a fish. The guys I matched with were a different breed. The first one was a poet who spent the entire date apologizing for his own existence. He kept saying things like, "As a man, I recognize my inherent privilege and I'm actively working to deconstruct it." It was like talking to a textbook. There was no personality, just a collection of pre-approved phrases. The next guy was an artist who told me he was polyamorous and that monogamy was a tool of the patriarchy to control women's bodies. He then invited me back to his place to meet his 2 other partners. I declined. Another one seemed promising. He was involved in local politics. He used all the right terminology. We had a decent conversation, and at the end of the night, he leaned in and whispered, "I find your righteous anger so hot." I felt like a fetish. Every date was a performance. These men weren't partners. They were applicants, desperately trying to say the right things to pass an ideological purity test. It was exhausting. Jack was simple, sure, but he was real. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. I pushed the thought away. This was just a rough patch. I was weeding out the bad ones. My work at the nonprofit started to feel more and more pointless. We'd have these long circular meetings about outreach strategies and synergizing our core message. It was all just corporate jargon applied to social justice. We weren't actually helping anyone. We were just talking. My evenings were spent in online arguments. I'd get into epic comment wars, spending hours crafting the perfect takedown of some anonymous troll. I'd feel a rush of victory when they'd stop replying, but the feeling never lasted. It was a hollow win. The world didn't feel any better. I just felt angrier. My friendship with Emma started to feel competitive. It was no longer about mutual support. It was about who was the better activist, who was more woke. If I shared an article, she'd share one that was more radical. If I went to a protest, she'd post pictures from a different, more important one. We'd have conversations that felt like verbal chess matches, each of us trying to checkmate the other with a more obscure bit of theory. I started to feel isolated, even when I was surrounded by people who supposedly agreed with me. A couple of months passed like this, a gray blur of disappointing dates, meaningless work, and toxic friendships. I thought about Jack more than I wanted to admit, not in a "I want him back" way, but in a "I wonder what he's doing" way. I was sure he was miserable. He had to be. He was a simple guy. He wouldn't know how to function without a woman to organize his life. One night, I couldn't take the curiosity anymore. My fingers hovered over the search bar on social media. It felt like a betrayal of my principles, like I was checking up on my oppressor. I typed in his name. His profile was public. I braced myself for what I'd find. Sad selfies, vague, depressing song lyrics, a desperate post about being lonely. None of the above. The first picture I saw stopped me cold. It was Jack, standing with 3 other men. They were all covered in dirt and sawdust. Behind them was a dilapidated-looking old barn or garage. Jack was smiling, a real, genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. He looked happy. The caption was simple: "The new project begins." Big thanks to Robert, Carl, and Mike for the help. I didn't recognize the other names. Robert was an older guy, maybe in his 40s, with a graying beard and a calm, confident look. Carl was big, built like a brick wall with a friendly, goofy grin. Mike was leaner, wearing glasses, looking a bit more reserved, but still smiling. There were no women in the picture. I scrolled down. There were more photos posted over the last couple of months. Pictures of them tearing down old walls, putting up new support beams, laying a concrete floor. They were building something, together. There were a few pictures of them just hanging out, a barbecue, a fishing trip. In every single photo, Jack looked relaxed. He looked content. There was one picture of him holding up a massive fish with a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face. I remembered how I used to make fun of guys who posed with fish. Seeing him like that, it didn't make me laugh. It made me feel a strange pang in my chest. I showed the pictures to Emma the next day. I was expecting her to join me in mocking them. "Look at this," I said, trying to sound amused. "He started some kind of weird boys club." Emma glanced at the phone and scoffed. "Pathetic," she said. "A bunch of men retreating into a fragile male space because they can't handle a world with powerful women." She called it a sausage fest, a monument to toxic masculinity. I nodded along, but her words felt hollow, because I looked at the pictures again. I saw them working together, teaching each other, achieving something tangible. I saw camaraderie. I didn't see anything toxic. I saw a group of men building a workshop, and I saw my ex-boyfriend, the man I had written off as a simple, unevolved project, looking happier and more fulfilled than he ever had with me. The discovery didn't make me feel powerful or vindicated. It just made me feel confused, and, for the first time in a long time, incredibly alone. I closed the app, but the image of Jack's smiling face was burned into my mind. Something was happening in his world, something real and constructive. And in my world, everything felt like it was starting to fall apart. The next few weeks were a blur. My obsession with Jack's new life grew into a quiet, secret ritual. I never told Emma I was still looking. It felt like a betrayal, like I was consorting with the enemy. Every night, after another day of feeling invisible at work and drained by online arguments, I'd open up my laptop. It was my one guilty pleasure. His profile wasn't just a highlight reel. It was a story unfolding in real time. The dilapidated barn was transforming. They installed large windows, ran electrical wiring, and insulated the walls. Carl, the big guy, was clearly the expert. There were photos of him showing the others how to frame a wall or use a power tool. Mike, the quiet IT guy, was in charge of the tech side. I saw a post about him setting up a security system and a sound system for the workshop. Robert, the older man, seemed to be the mentor, the glue holding it all together. He wasn't in as many of the action shots, but he was always there, observing, guiding. And Jack. Jack was learning. I saw pictures of him, concentration etched on his face, carefully measuring a piece of wood. There was a short video of him successfully welding two pieces of metal together for the first time, followed by the sound of the other guys cheering him on. I remembered how he'd once tried to assemble a simple bookshelf for me. He'd gotten so frustrated he almost threw the instructions across the room. Now he was building things, real things. My own life felt increasingly flimsy in comparison. The nonprofit I worked for launched a new awareness campaign. It involved a series of pastel-colored infographics with vague, uplifting slogans. We spent weeks debating the font. The campaign got a few hundred likes, mostly from other nonprofits. Nothing changed. It felt like shouting into a pillow. My dating life was a black comedy. I met a guy who lectured me for 10 minutes because I used the word crazy to describe the traffic. He said it was ableist language. He then spent the rest of the date talking about his ex-girlfriend in a way that was far from enlightened. It seemed like all these woke men had just learned a new language to mask the same old boring selfishness. They didn't respect women. They just feared being called out. Emma was becoming more and more militant. Our conversations were no longer about sharing our lives. They were about her delivering pronouncements. She declared that all heterosexual relationships were inherently oppressive. She said that any woman who still dated men was suffering from internalized misogyny. I'd just nod along, feeling a growing distance between us. I didn't have the energy to argue, to defend a position I wasn't even sure I held anymore. One Saturday, I was having a particularly bad day. My landlord had sent a notice about a rent increase I couldn't afford. I'd gotten into a stupid, pointless fight with my mom on the phone. I felt adrift and overwhelmed. I needed a friend. I called Emma. She picked up, sounding annoyed. "I'm a little busy, Bernice." I started to explain what was wrong, my voice cracking a little. She cut me off. "Look, I can't really deal with this right now. There's a huge online debate happening about a problematic comedian, and I need to focus my energy on that. It's really important. She wasn't listening. She was just waiting for me to finish so she could get back to her digital crusade. Okay, I said quietly. Sorry to bother you. I hung up and just sat there, in the silence of my apartment. A debate about a comedian was more important than her friend having a breakdown. That night, I logged on to check Jack's profile. I needed the distraction. There was a new album of photos. The caption read, "The Beast has arrived." The pictures showed them unloading a massive rust-covered shell of a car from a flatbed truck. It was an old muscle car, a forgotten relic. It looked like it had been sitting in a field for 50 years. There were pictures of them pushing it into their newly finished workshop. The final photo was of the four of them standing in front of the car, arms crossed, looking at it like it was the greatest challenge of their lives. They looked determined, excited, united by a common goal. They weren't just building a workshop anymore. They were going to bring that car back to life. The project was absurdly ambitious. I knew nothing about cars, but even I could tell that thing was a lost cause. But they didn't see it that way. I saw a comment on the post from some random person. "You guys are crazy. That thing is a rust bucket." Robert, the older guy, replied, "Every piece of steel has a memory. We're just helping it remember what it used to be." The reply was so simple, so profound. It wasn't a clever takedown or a sarcastic jab. It was just a quiet statement of purpose. I thought about my own purpose, writing angry comments, arguing with my friends, feeling miserable. For the first time, it wasn't just confusion I felt. It was a sharp, painful envy. My life revolved around deconstruction, tearing things down, pointing out flaws. Their lives revolved around construction, building things up, creating value from nothing. The contrast was becoming unbearable. A few weeks later, my life took a nosedive. There was a restructuring at my nonprofit. My position was deemed redundant. I was laid off. They gave me a small severance package and a lot of corporate speak about moving in a new direction. I was devastated. That job, as frustrating as it was, had been a core part of my identity. I was Bernice, the social justice advocate. Now, who was I? I told Emma the news, expecting sympathy. She said, "Well, it was a problematic organization anyway. It was part of the nonprofit industrial complex. This is an opportunity for you to find something more aligned with your values." No, I'm sorry that happened. No, how are you feeling? Just another ideological lecture. That was the moment I realized Emma wasn't my friend. She was my high priestess, and I had just been excommunicated from her church. The loneliness became a physical presence, a heavy weight in my chest. Days were spent sending out resumes for jobs I didn't want. Nights were spent watching Jack and his friends work on the car. They were stripping it down to the bare metal. Every post was a progress report. "Engine's out!" with a picture of a greasy engine block hanging from a chain. "Found more rust than we expected, but Carl's a magician with the grinder." Mike figured out the wiring diagram. The man's a genius. They weren't just fixing a car. They were learning, problem-solving, relying on each other's skills. One evening, a minor disaster struck in my apartment. I was washing dishes when I heard a gurgling sound, and then a sudden gush of water. The pipe under the sink had burst. Not just a leak, a full-on rupture. Water was flooding my kitchen floor. I panicked. I threw towels on the floor, but they were soaked in seconds. I called my landlord's emergency number. It went to voicemail. I frantically searched online for a 24-hour plumber. I found one and called. The guy who answered sounded half asleep. He said he could be there in about 2 hours, and it would be a massive emergency call-out fee. I had no choice. I agreed. As I sat there, watching the water spread, feeling completely helpless, my mind went to a strange place. I thought about Jack. I remembered a time when our old coffee maker had broken. He'd spent a whole Saturday afternoon taking it apart, watching tutorials online, and figuring out how to fix a tiny, broken plastic piece inside. I had been annoyed at the time, telling him to just buy a new one. He had looked up from the table, covered in coffee grounds, and said, "But I want to see if I can fix it." And he did. He fixed it. And he was so proud of himself for the rest of the day. I had dismissed it as a pointless masculine need to tinker. Now, sitting in my flooded kitchen, waiting to pay a stranger a fortune to do something I had no idea how to do, I saw it differently. It wasn't about tinkering. It was about competence. It was about self-reliance. 2 hours later, the plumber finally arrived. He took one look, sighed dramatically, and spent 20 minutes fixing it with a part from his truck. The bill was astronomical. It took a huge bite out of my meager severance pay. After he left, I was left to clean up the mess. As I was mopping the floor, exhausted and miserable, my phone buzzed. It was a notification. Jack had posted a new video. I dried my hands and opened it. It was a time lapse. It showed the car's engine, completely disassembled, every single piece laid out on a clean tarp. The video then showed them meticulously cleaning every gear, every piston, every bolt. Then, piece by painstaking piece, they began to reassemble it. The video was set to some classic rock music. It was mesmerizing. It ended with a shot of the fully reassembled engine block, clean and painted, looking brand new. The final frame was a text overlay. Phase 1 complete. She has a heart again. I watched the video 3 times. Then I looked around my own life. A broken pipe, a lost job, a fake friend, a dwindling bank account. I had nothing. I was building nothing. I was fixing nothing. All my theories, all my righteous anger, all my deconstruction of the world's problems. What had it gotten me? I was alone in a damp apartment, poorer than I was yesterday, with no one to call. The men in that video, the ones I had written off as simpletons retreating from the modern world, they had a purpose. They had a community. They had skills. They were building a life, not just talking about one. I started to question everything, not just Jack, not just my relationship with him. Everything. The ideology that had been my compass for years now felt like a broken instrument, spinning wildly, pointing in every direction at once. Was toxic masculinity really about men fixing cars and helping their friends? Was female empowerment really about isolating yourself and attacking anyone who didn't perfectly align with your views? The foundation of my entire worldview was cracking, and through those cracks, a terrifying thought started to seep in. What if I was wrong? Not just wrong about Jack. What if I was wrong about everything? The layoff was the catalyst. It shattered the routine that had kept my doubts at bay. With no job to go to and no activist circles to engage with, my days became vast, empty landscapes. The only landmark in that landscape was Jack's social media page. It was no longer a guilty pleasure. It was a lifeline. I watched as the car project progressed from a mechanical puzzle to a work of art. They started on the bodywork. The posts were filled with pictures of them sanding, patching, and priming. It was slow, tedious work. There were no grand pronouncements of victory, just quiet updates. Got the driver's side door panel smooth today. Carl taught us how to avoid warping the metal. There was a humility to it that struck me. They weren't pretending to be experts. They were learning, and they weren't ashamed to show the process. Meanwhile, my job search was a soul-crushing parade of rejections. I'd apply for positions at other non-profits, but my resume now seemed to scream professional arguer. I bombed an interview when I got into a debate with the hiring manager about the problematic implications of their company's mission statement. I left feeling righteous and unemployed. The righteousness faded fast. I was burning through my severance pay. The rent increase I couldn't afford before was now an existential threat. Desperation led me to apply for jobs outside my bubble, retail, customer service, anything. I got a job as a barista at a local coffee shop, the same kind of place where I used to sit with Emma and judge the world. Now I was the one serving the oat milk lattes. The irony was thick enough to taste. The work was humbling. It was repetitive, physically tiring, and my customers were often rude and demanding. But it was also real. I wasn't debating abstract theories. I was making something a person could hold. I was providing a service. There was a clear relationship between my effort and the result. I do the work. I get paid. My old job felt like a dream in comparison, a long, boring meeting I had finally woken up from. One afternoon at work, a man came in. He was older, with a kind face and a familiar graying beard. It was Robert, the guy from Jack's photos. My heart hammered in my chest. I kept my head down, hoping he wouldn't recognize me. He ordered a black coffee. As I handed it to him, our eyes met for a second. There was no flicker of recognition. To him, I was just the girl behind the counter. He paid, said, "Thank you," and left. I watched him walk away, and it hit me. I was a complete stranger to this new, important part of Jack's life. I was a ghost from a past he had thoroughly moved on from. The work on the car continued. They were finally painting it. The color they chose was a deep, classic blue. There were pictures of them, covered in protective gear, carefully applying coat after coat. The workshop was sealed off with plastic sheeting. It looked like a surgical theater. They were treating this old piece of metal with more care and reverence than I had ever treated my relationship with Jack. My own social life was non-existent. The few people from my old circle who still talked to me would send me links to articles or call-out posts. It felt like they were sending messages from a different planet. I no longer spoke the language. One person who didn't forget me was my old friend Emma. She must have heard I was working at the coffee shop. She came in one day, flanked by two of her new disciples. It was a power move. She was there to gloat. She walked up to the counter and looked at me, a smug little smile on her face. "Bernice." "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "So, this is what you're doing now." I just looked at her. I didn't feel angry, I just felt tired. "What can I get for you, Emma?" I asked, my voice flat. She ordered the most complicated, obnoxious drink on the menu, making a big show of it for her friends. As I was making it, she leaned in conspiratorially. "You know," she said in a stage whisper, "it's a shame. You had so much potential, but you just couldn't stay committed to the cause. You let your personal feelings get in the way." I finished her drink and slid it across the counter. "That'll be $7.50, I said. She paid, and as she was leaving, she turned back one last time. "It's really sad to see you serving the patriarchy, one cup at a time." They walked out laughing. I stood there, my hands shaking. Not with rage, but with a weird sense of clarity. She thought she was landing a devastating blow, but her words had no power anymore. Serving a cup of coffee felt 1,000 times more useful than anything she was doing. A few nights later, the final post I had been subconsciously waiting for appeared. It was an album titled, "She's Done." I clicked on it. My breath caught in my throat. The first photo was the car. The blue paint was so deep it looked wet. The chrome gleamed under the workshop lights. The engine, the interior, the wheels. Everything was perfect. It wasn't just a restored car, it was a masterpiece. The subsequent photos were of the guys. There was one of Carl, the big builder, leaning against the front fender, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. There was one of Mike, the IT guy, sitting in the driver's seat, looking at the dashboard with a nerdy intensity, probably checking the electronics he'd so carefully installed. There was one of Robert, the mentor, standing a little ways back, watching the younger guys with a proud, fatherly expression. And then there was the photo of Jack. He was just standing next to the car, one hand resting on the hood. He wasn't smiling a huge, goofy grin. It was a small, calm smile. His face looked different. The lingering uncertainty and confusion that had always been in his eyes when he was with me was gone. It was replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense of competence, a sense of peace. He looked like a man who knew his own worth, a man who didn't need anyone else's validation. This was the man he had become after I had told him he wasn't enough. The final picture was of all of them together. They were gathered around the car, some sitting on the bumper, some leaning against it. No one was posing for the camera. It was a candid shot. They were laughing about something. The image was a perfect portrait of male friendship, of shared accomplishment, of a community they had built with their own hands for themselves. They hadn't done it in opposition to women. They hadn't done it to prove a point. They had just done it. I looked at that picture for a long, long time. I saw their joy, their pride, their bond. Then I looked at my own life, the tiny apartment, the barista apron hanging on a hook, the silence. The chasm between their world and mine was immense. I had spent years trying to find a community built on a shared sense of grievance. We bonded over what we were against. They had built a community based on a shared purpose. They bonded over what they were for. My ideology had promised me empowerment and sisterhood. It had delivered loneliness and resentment. I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of my mistake. It wasn't just that I had been a bad girlfriend to Jack. I had been a bad partner to myself. I had outsourced my thinking to an ideology, let it tell me who to be, what to feel, and who to love. I had dismissed loyalty, competence, and simple, quiet happiness as problematic. I closed the laptop. The glow of the screen faded, leaving me in the dark. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I hadn't had in years. resolve. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't get Jack back, and I knew I didn't deserve to. But I could stop being the person I had become. I deleted all of my social media accounts, every last one. The silence was terrifying at first, then liberating. The constant hum of outrage in my head finally quieted down. I went to work. I made coffee. I was polite to my customers. I went home. I paid my bills. It was a simple, unglamorous existence. But it was mine. A few weeks later, I found the courage to do one last thing. I found Jack's email address from an old exchange. My hands trembled as I typed. I kept it short. I didn't make excuses. I didn't ask for anything. "Hi, Jack," I wrote. "I saw the pictures of the car. It looks incredible. You all did an amazing job. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong." I stared at the word wrong for a full minute. It was the hardest word I had ever had to write. I added one more line. "I hope you are happy." I hit send before I could lose my nerve. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't deserve one. A few hours later, my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from him. My heart leaped into my throat. I opened it. The message was just as short as mine. "Thanks, Bernice. I appreciate you saying that. All the best to you." That was it. No anger, no "I told you so." But no warmth either. It was polite. It was final. It was the closing of a door. He had moved on. He had his world, and I had mine. I read his email, and I didn't feel sad. I felt closure. My story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. I didn't magically find a new, better boyfriend. I didn't suddenly become a master mechanic. I'm still working at the coffee shop. I'm still paying off debt. Life is still hard. But something has changed inside me. The other day, the faucet in my bathroom started dripping, a small, annoying drip that kept me up at night. My first instinct was to call the landlord, to find someone else to solve my problem. But then I stopped. I thought about Jack and his friends. I thought about the car. I went online. I didn't search for a plumber. I searched how to fix a dripping faucet. I watched a few videos. I went to the hardware store. I bought a wrench and some small rubber washers. I came home, turned off the water, and took the faucet apart, just like the video showed. It was frustrating. I dropped a screw down the drain. I couldn't get the old washer out at first, but I kept at it. An hour later, I turned the water back on. I held my breath and listened. Silence, no drip. I stood there in my tiny bathroom, holding a rusty wrench, my hands dirty. And for the first time, in as long as I can remember, I felt a genuine sense of pride. I hadn't deconstructed anything. I hadn't raised awareness. I hadn't won an argument. I had fixed something. It was a small thing, a tiny thing, but it was a start.